So welcome everybody to this webinar, part of the City Archived series of the Hong Kong Studies Initiative at UBC. So my name is Leo Shin. I'm a faculty member in History and Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia. And for those who may not be familiar with what we do here or what the Hong Kong Studies Initiative is about, you can of course go to our website and check out our social media. But in short, what we are trying to do here is to promote the study, the teaching and research of Hong Kong at the university, but also to help promote the study of Hong Kong globally. I guess one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that we're able to bring in speakers from different parts of the world and also to draw audience from different parts of the world. So yeah, let's think positively, right? So let me start by also acknowledging that the Point Grey campus of the University of British Columbia is located in the unceded, traditional, and ancestral territory of the Musqueam people. And we are very grateful to be able to continue to learn, teach, do our research in this place. So our speaker today, Amelia Allsop of the Hong Kong Heritage Project, is going to give us an introduction to the wonderful project they're doing over there, and also especially oral history component. So I will simply acknowledge the various units on campus that are supporting this event, and I'll pass it over to the moderator today. So the event today is sponsored by the Department of Asian Studies, the Department of History, the Center for Chinese Research, the Asian Library, the Interdisciplinary Histories Research Cluster. So various units on campus are very interested in supporting Hong Kong studies and also supporting our bringing speakers from different parts of the world. So let me also let me pass it to our moderator, who will then provide a proper introduction to our speaker. So Ryan Sun is a PhD student in history. He's working on a topic on Jewish refugees, diaspora in Asia, in Hong Kong. So this is actually a very a perfect topic for him to moderate. So Ryan, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Dr. Shin, and welcome everyone to our presentation today. I'll briefly begin with an introduction of our presenter, Amelia, and then I'll let her work her magic. So Amelia moved to Hong Kong in 2007 to help establish the Hong Kong Heritage Project, the archive of the Kaduri family. In her role as collections manager, she worked closely with the project archivists to set up the archive, now a major repository and an important driver of new scholarship about Hong Kong's history. Amelia has recorded over 200 oral history interviews, helping to create one of the largest oral history collections in Hong Kong. She enjoys opening up the archive and telling its untold stories using a diversity of platforms, from websites to heritage-themed board games, exhibitions, and short films. In 2015, Amelia returned to London to pursue a part-time PhD in history at King's College London, while continuing her work with the project. Amelia has written several corporate history books for the Kaduri businesses, including most recently Taiping, an artisanal tradition since 1956 for Taiping carpets, published in 2019. So without further ado, Amelia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you very much, Ryan, for inviting me to give this talk today, and to Dr. Shin. I've been following UBC's Hong Kong Studies Initiative with a great deal of interest, so it's a real pleasure to be here today. A little background about me. You've just heard from Ryan that I work for the Hong Kong Heritage Project. I've been with the Heritage Project since 2007, and I worked mostly on the archives side. But I was also responsible for collecting the oral history interviews on the English language side. That led me to meet a lot of really interesting people in Hong Kong, such as American missionaries, Orthodox Russians, Portuguese Macanese, British civil servants, Shanghainese ship owners, Jewish refugees who had fled Europe for Shanghai, and Marine police officers. And I'll be sharing some of their stories today. So this presentation is primarily based on the foreign communities of Hong Kong. So today's presentation, I'll be talking about three topics today. The first is to give you a little bit of background about the Hong Kong Heritage Project, the Kaduri family who started the project, and I'll also be talking about the background to why we started our oral history program, which is the basis of my interview today. The second is a little bit of stories from those people that I interviewed, some oral history case studies. And I'll also briefly discuss oral history in for-profit environments as opposed to not-for-profit environments. And finally, I will briefly discuss the uses of oral history, how we use oral history at the Hong Kong Heritage Project. And I'll also talk about the new museum that the Heritage Project is opening, which will open in 2022 in Hong Kong. So a little bit of background about the Hong Kong Heritage Project. The Heritage Project was founded by Sir Michael Kaduri in 2007 to collect, preserve, and make available to the public documents, photographs, and films relating to the history of the Kaduri family, their businesses, and their charitable work in Hong Kong and overseas. So today, the archive is housed in the headquarters of CLP in Hong Kong, Kowloon, and the archive has been used by hundreds of scholars and local and international, and it's contributed to new scholarship, new directions in Hong Kong history. I think in order to understand our collections, you really have to first understand the Kaduri family. And the Kaduris are a really fascinating family who first came to Hong Kong in the 19th century via the Sassoon diaspora. They've been written about extensively, most recently by Jonathan Kaufman in his book, Last Kings of Shanghai, which is published by Viking in 2020. Sir Eli Kaduri arrived in Hong Kong in the early 1880s, and he was closely followed by his brother, Sir Ellis, sorry. Together, the two brothers, Eli and Ellis, invested in quite a number of Hong Kong foundling companies, such as the Hong Kong and Shanghai Hotels, which is the operator of the Peak Tram and the Peninsula Hotel in Hong Kong, among other entities. And these are quite well-known tourist sites in Hong Kong. They also invested in Power, which was founded in 1901, which is a utilities firm on Kowloon and the New Territories. The Kaduris were also active in the sphere of philanthropy, both in Hong Kong and overseas. In Hong Kong, they're perhaps best known for the Kaduri Farm, which is still there today in Tai Po. It originally started in 1951 as a Kaduri Agricultural Aid Association to help refugees coming down from China and to help them establish themselves as farmers. So it did things like livestock loans, irrigation schemes, infrastructure schemes in the New Territories. The Kaduris, being Jewish, they also helped other Jewish communities that came to Hong Kong, such as refugees who had fled Nazism and came to Shanghai as a kind of quasi-open port in the 1930s. And they set up this school called the Shanghai Jewish Youth Association School. And there you can see on your screens some of the students at the school in 1940. So I've just briefly mentioned some of the activities of the Kaduris in Hong Kong's economy, in philanthropy. So because of these, it means that the collection is quite diverse and it offers some fascinating new insights into Hong Kong's history. So why oral history? The oral history method has been a very important part of our archive creation activities since the beginning of the project in 2007. When we first started the project 14 years ago, oral history programs in Hong Kong were largely confined to the universities, such as the excellent an extensive University of Hong Kong Voices project under Dr. Elizabeth Sin, which I think started in 2006 and is now the Hong Kong Memory Project. A lot of you may be familiar with it if you've used the website. There's quite a lot of digital resources on there in oral histories. And there was also quite a number of government-run cultural institutions that had heritage projects, oral history programs as well, such as the Hong Kong Museum of History and the Film Archive and RTHK, the radio broadcaster. But being a corporate archive, there was not, well, firstly, there was only one other corporate archive in Hong Kong when we first started, and that was HSBC. And I think it's fair to say that there were not many business-led oral history programs in Hong Kong when we started back in 2007. So being a corporate archive, it is worth probing the reasons why we chose to embark on an extensive oral history program. I think firstly, our founder, Sir Michael Kaduri, was adamant that the archive should not be an introspective corporate archive. Secondly, oral history is a more equal and democratic form of history that allows for a multiplicity of standpoints to be created. In our case, oral history promotes social inclusivity, as archives often tell the stories of elites. Similarly, oral history can help create a more linguistically diverse collection. The Kaduri family, as we've seen, are a non-Chinese family, so around 80 to 90% of the collection is in English, perhaps 10 to 20% in Chinese, and a very small proportion is in French. So by interviewing Hong Kong citizens, we can help redress this linguistic imbalance. Thirdly, oral history has allowed us to widen the scope beyond the businesses and beyond the philanthropic activities of the Kaduri family to tell a much wider social history of Hong Kong. So that takes us to the second part of my presentation, which is about capturing oral histories and just some experience sharing from my own perspective. So from 2007 to 2017, we interviewed over 500 men and women from different backgrounds in English and Cantonese. Today, the Heritage Project holds the largest filmed oral history collection in Hong Kong. I'll be talking about the capture of oral history on the English-speaking side and sharing some of the stories from those I interviewed. So the China Coast community. One of my earliest oral history projects was a series of interviews with 6 residents at the China Coast community in 2008. The China Coast community is a residential care home in Kowloon Tong, and it's a charity that provides care for English-speaking persons regardless of their financial circumstances. Applicants need to have spent a significant portion of their lives in Hong Kong or Asia to qualify for residency. So as you can see, this organization was really a boon for me, and I was able to get in touch with people from different backgrounds who had also spent a majority of their lives in Hong Kong and the China Coast. Interviews with these old China hands show that Hong Kong was a really diverse and mixed port city in the 1930s and 1940s. Many of those I interviewed were Portuguese Macanese or Portuguese Dutch, or so-called Eurasians, those from mixed Chinese and British heritage. Only one was British. That there were so many Portuguese at the China Coast community, a charitable organization, reflects the fact that generally speaking, the Portuguese in Hong Kong were confined to middle class or lower middle class roles in the colony because of these pernicious racial hierarchies that were perpetuated by the British. So the Portuguese often formed a middle layer in colonial firms between the Chinese and the British because of their linguistic skills. So many were employed in these kind of old hongs in financial or administrative roles in companies like Shell or HSBC, Jardines or CLP. So the interviews were also interesting because they show how people came to Hong Kong through these networks of empire and how Hong Kong was connected to Treaty Port China by these networks of commerce and people. So of course, foreign powers wrested legal and commercial concessions from China after the Opium Wars, and the treaty ports in Hong Kong were of course a result of this, and they were foreign ruled enclaves in China. So for example, we see this through the interviewees. One of them was born in Shanghai. She moved to Hong Kong soon after the start of the Chinese Civil War. Another was born in the French concession of Charmine and the family in Guangzhou. and the family moved to Hong Kong because the father was transferred with the Shell company to Hong Kong. So one topic which loomed large in these interviews was the 1967 riots. I'm absolutely not an expert on the 67 riots, but it was very interesting to hear their stories about the 67 riots, which were an anti-colonial movement in Hong Kong that was influenced by the really abysmal working conditions in the factories, and also politically influenced by the Cultural Revolution in China. More recently, historians like Ray Yep have furthered our understanding of the riots, why they happened, who were the rioters, and what were the colonial responses to the riots. And so, of course, although these China Coast interviewees were not participants of the riots, they helped shed light on public memory of the riots from the perspective of the British and the Portuguese. The interviewees also shared stories about the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong, because Portugal was neutral during the Second World War. It meant that Portuguese nationals in Hong Kong were not interned. So while some Portuguese interviewees spoke of hardships and violence meted out by the Japanese soldiers, others were much more ambivalent about the Japanese, and actually some of them had good relationships with Japanese soldiers. So hopefully this will work. I've got a clip to show you, a short clip of some of the China Coast interviewees.
You know, it's Tunghua, Eastern, Tunghua, Honghua, QE, QM, Jianyou, Chengcheng.
I came with the fleet, the Navy, in 1948, and I was there. And I joined Hong Kong Electric Company in 1950. I was chased home one night with a lift in my car. The rioters came chasing after me in their car. And I said to the police before I left, "Are you going to escort me home?" They said, "No, you carry on first. We'll come behind you." And I never saw them behind me, and I'm driving in my car, then all of a sudden, like halfway up, I was stopped. Well, the rioters, they started banging out the car, and I just kept my window shut. And eventually the police did come up behind me. Yeah.
That was the trouble. They had that riot. Then everybody was nervous. Then they decided to migrate. Anyway, a lot of Chinese migrated to Canada, and then they came back after the year. You know, but it was rough. You know, the Hilton at that time, you know, Garden Road, you see all these guys with the banners and everything. Yeah, they didn't come. Believe you me, I didn't get involved at that before.
One day I went home after working at Matilda Hospital, and next door to us was a communist school. That was in Peel Street. I was living in Peel Street with my parents and my brother. And then I went home, and then suddenly, near my house, it was cordoned off. Police wouldn't let me go home. I said, "What happened?" "Oh, something happening in the school. They're not allowed to go home yet." So I went to my neighbor's home, which is on the terrace just below us, and sat there and chatted with her until finally I was allowed to go home. And then I found out what happened was they were making some homemade bombs in the school, and one of them exploded.
We went there in my father's office to take shelter when this happened, when Hong Kong fell. So of course we couldn't stay there indefinitely. We had not sufficient supply of food. So my brother ventured out, my eldest brother Adio. When he got down the cemetery, he said, what are you doing?" He said he had to confess. He said he had to go out and get food because no food. So he said, "You must see our commander," which was Tanaka, and he came up and he looked at her. And then he went and opened the stores in Crawford, and he supplied us with food until we were able to go to the cafeteria when they resumed activities.
And then in those days, during the Japanese occupation of Macau, we didn't have toys to play with. So what we did, we drew paper dolls of our own and drew clothing for them and cut them for them to wear. And we played on the pavement, hopscotch in Macau and things like that. It was very simple life, but we didn't have to suffer during the Japanese occupation because in Macau, the Portuguese government and the British consulate took care of us. We were housed in a refugee camp, and they fed us and so forth. So we survived pretty well.
So female voices are nearly always underrepresented in history, and Hong Kong's history is no exception, whether this be British or Chinese women or others. At around the time of my interviews with residents of the China Coast community, I was also speaking to a number of upper-class British female expatriates, some of whom had been born in Hong Kong, and they came from a very different social strata to the China Coast interviewees. One recurring theme of these interviews were the social mores of British high society, which revolved around the clubs and the hotels at that time. So reminiscences around colonial social and cultural traditions can help us understand the British identity in colonial Hong Kong. So I'd just like to show you another clip of some of the interviewees talking about the social life in Hong Kong at that time.
During the From the flamboyance of the swinging 30s to the hardships of the Second World War, Westerners in Hong Kong were witness to sweeping change as they watched the British colony develop from a sleepy outpost to a booming port and a thriving metropolis. During the early colonial era, social conventions and forms of entertainment were exported from England, although serving to reinforce a sense of Britishness and cultural separation. Such social traditions were important in engendering a home away from home.
The hotels, like the Hong Kong Hotel, the Peninsula, and the Gloucester used to have dances every evening, and you'd dance until 7.
And what kind of dances? Just
ballroom.
Ballroom.
Oh yes, yes, very elegant ballroom dancing. And the last tune they used to play was "Good Night, Sweetheart."
And then, of course, the big thing was St George's Ball, which was at the Peninsula. So we used to parade down from the ballroom, down those big wide stairs, all decorated with roses. We used to do that the day before. Real roses from England.
You know, and I was playing in a band on weekends and doing what they called tea dances in those days, which were afternoon sessions on Saturday, Sunday from about 4 to 6 o'clock in the afternoon, where all the teenage kids would go and do the latest dances and we would play all the latest songs.
We used to go out by train and we were picked up at Shumshui, I think, Shumshui, with a pedicycle and driven to the clubhouse. And very, very strict, no mingling with the men.
So by showing you that clip, I hope, and I don't want to portray women at that time as one-dimensional people who were only interested in the Saturday tea dance, because this was far from the truth. The historian of Western women in Hong Kong, Susanna Ho, writes that Western women led private rather than public lives in Hong Kong, as was and she also reminds us that Western women played many different roles in the colony, as political radicals, as missionaries, as war heroines. These were certainly conflicted roles when it came to their relationships with the Chinese, but they weren't passive and they weren't insular. Around 2 years later, in 2010, I interviewed 12 retired members of the Marine Police, while my Hong also interviewed 12 members of the Marine Police from the Chinese side, from the Chinese officers. The interviews were to be used as part of an exhibition held at 1881 Heritage, titled Sailing Through Time from 1881. So 1881 Heritage is a revitalized heritage site home to a hotel, a restaurant and a shopping complex at Jim Sa Jui in Kowloon. And it was once home to the Marine Police headquarters, hence our interviews. So research is of course vital to the oral history process, especially when interviewing people whose personal or professional identities straddle multiple historiographies and whose stories encompass specific geographies or linguistic terms specific to that group. So I found this to be particularly true when interviewing the Marine Police officers. The interviewees had intimate knowledge of Hong Kong's maritime worlds and constantly used language that was specific to their profession and the worlds in which they inhabited. So I found these interviews to be really quite challenging and were much more challenging than the earlier interviews. The interviews with the Marine Police invoke a strong sense of place. They tell the social history of the former Marine Police headquarters at a time when the function of the building and its urban context had radically changed. So you can see the photograph at the top, which is 1960s, 1970s of the former Marine Police headquarters, and compare it to the one below. So little bit dangerous territory, but I hope to show you a clip, another clip from the exhibition film. Hopefully it will work, and which shows the officers talk about the social and administrative purpose of the building and the colonial traditions that were part of its culture.
Well, the Marine Police Headquarters in Choi wasn't just offices for the senior staff. It was where the crews actually changed duties. When we went there, got into our uniforms, we had our kit lockers, the armory was there, the stores was there, our mess was there with a little bar. So without knowing, that was a working police station.
A lovely grass lawn in those days, which ran out to the tower, the signal tower, yeah. So there was room in those days to actually parade your crew, inspect them, march them up and down a bit, shout so that the senior officers inside could hear you were on the job.
At that time, there were very few police stations in the land which had an officer's mess with a bar. So the Mariner's Rest, is what it was called, was one of the first.
Yeah, the Mariner's Rest. Yeah. That was the social centre for Marine headquarters. And when you joined, every officer was a member of, you always were a member of the mess anyway, but it wasn't a residential mess. All the other stations had residential messes. Because we were on boats, we didn't have a residential mess. So always lunchtimes were in there, but every Friday, if I say every Friday, it might have worked out once every second Friday as time went on, just as numbers dwindled. There would always be a curry lunch on there. There would always be a lunch if your curry lunch if your monthly conference was on. And these curries came from, they started off with the Indian constables that were in Tsim Sha Tsui. Then it became the fashion for the sergeants to learn to make these curries.
In those days, the whole compound was a fairly busy place with all these different units involved in one building. And in fact, some of the officers were even out in the old Nissen huts that were out on the lawn in front of the building, as well as the canteen, which was probably one of the main focal points for the whole building.
So these interviews can also tell us about the dynamics between British and Chinese members of the Marine Police. I mentioned earlier that we interviewed both British and Chinese officers. This meant that my colleagues were able to compare the transcripts and see the different perspectives and approaches of the interviewees to the same questions. For example, my colleagues tell me that the English language interviews were more likely to say that there was a good relationship between British and Chinese officers, while the Chinese speakers were more likely to say the opposite. They remembered instances of discrimination. Of course, the interviews reflect on a time when Hong Kong was under colonial rule and when promotions was predicated on being white and British. By interviewing members of the same community but in different languages, we can more readily understand multiple perspectives and capture different voices that tell the history of colonialism in Hong Kong. And I think that the bilingual nature of our oral history program is therefore really beneficial from a research perspective. One subject area that I found particularly fascinating, and which the Marine police officers discussed at length, was the Vietnamese refugee crisis, especially during the late 1980s and early 1990s. So that's at the tail end of the refugee influx. Vietnamese refugees, otherwise known as Vietnamese boat people, started to arrive in Hong Kong after the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, and again in 1979 as a result of the Vietnamese government's persecution of its ethnic Chinese populations. In the 1980s, Hong Kong was a first port of asylum for refugees who were hoping to go to third destinations, third countries like America or the US or Europe. And at first it had quite a liberal policy, but it became more restrictive as time went on. So around 200,000 people sought asylum in Hong Kong, and most were resettled in other countries or repatriated back to Vietnam, and around 1,500 settled in Hong Kong. Marine police officers played quite a crucial role as intermediaries between the Hong Kong government, which developed policy, and refugee organizations such as the UNHCR, which was responsible for repatriation and resettlement, and the refugees themselves. So the Marine police were often the first point of contact for refugees as they entered Hong Kong waters. Marine police officers were responsible for searching refugee boats, towing them into town, providing them with food and medicine. They were also responsible for some of the detention camps on the outlying islands where refugees were held. By looking to our interviews with Marine police officers, we can see different attitudes and standpoints towards refugees from state actors such as the police. These interviews offer unexpected viewpoints, which might challenge our stereotypes about the police. For example, one Marine police officer was highly sympathetic to the refugee plight. He expressed his shock and horror at seeing the condition in which refugees arrived in Hong Kong. He said, "These arrived in pitiful states, sometimes with dead bodies tied to the side of the vessel because they wanted somebody to be buried on land. There were awful salt wounds and sun wounds, and obviously very, very hungry." He was also deeply ambivalent about government policy, and he actually refused to carry out an order to turn boats away from Hong Kong. And he believed at one point that this would put his career in jeopardy, although this was never actually a formal government policy to do this. On the other hand, some Marine police officers were less sympathetic to refugees. They linked the refugees with an upsurge of crime in Hong Kong. Others categorized them as economic migrants rather than refugees. They conceded that conditions in the detention centers were poor, but they also blamed refugees for instigating riots in the camp when North Vietnamese clashed with the South Vietnamese. But these were very much influenced by the fact that these refugees had been, sometimes for years and years in these detention centers, and the conditions there were really quite abysmal. The interviews also show how the government's refugee policy was chaotic and constantly changing and quite reactive. One policeman discusses the initial use of the outlying islands as an anchorage for refugee boats, but that this policy was soon changed because, and I quote, "Some of the boats were so unseaworthy that they began to sink. And in any case, the Vietnamese were going ashore to scavenge for stuff ashore. So in time, it was established that the whole island would be taken over as a camp for the Vietnamese, and the Marine police were drafted in to act as our guardians, or keepers, I suppose." Of course, when looking to the history of Vietnamese boat people in Hong Kong, it is imperative to give agency and voice to the refugees themselves. And this is something that various scholars have done, particularly someone like Karina Huang, whose Vietnamese boat people research is available online, and that's a really excellent website if you haven't seen that, but if you've got an interest in the subject, I really recommend looking at that. So having discussed some of our community-related interviews, I now want to touch upon our business-related oral histories. As I mentioned earlier, we hold the historic records of CLP, which is the utilities firm for Kowloon and the New Territories. And our archive is also based in CLP's headquarters. We have therefore sought to interview a lot of CLP retirees. So in this part of my presentation, I want to talk about those that we interviewed for CLP, but I also want to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities of recording oral history from the perspective of a corporate archive and in a for-profit environment. The oral historian Robert Perks highlights how oral history can help reveal a unique understanding of the way a business operates, potentially offering a far greater insight than the paper record can. Interviews can help put flesh on the bones of corporate archives by filling historical gaps in the written record or by incorporating a more human dimension to dry corporate records. It can also preserve the history of a workforce for whom few records are maintained. If we think about the kind of records kept by large corporations, and I think this is true across most large corporations, it's invariably always the high level records, and by high level I mean those kept at the very top of the organization, such as the board of directors and the chairman. So by recording these oral histories, we can redress this imbalance, and we can record the voices at every level of the organization. So what do these oral histories tell us about CLP and its employees? Through these interviews, we were able to uncover new stories about the lives of CLP staff during the Japanese occupation, for example. So one of my colleagues interviewed a former member of staff, Lee Kwok Leung, whose father, Lee Tung Sang, worked for CLP's account department, I think as a meter reader and a bill clerk. During the Battle of Hong Kong, he served as Admiral Chan Chak's bodyguard, which was a famous one-legged naval hero and revolutionary. And he also worked as an undercover agent for the British Army Aid Group, gathering intelligence for the British until he was exposed and captured. And he sadly died during the war. Through oral history, we are also able to record more uncomfortable and challenging histories that are not addressed in the written record. For example, our interviewees spoke about cable gangs, about possible corruption, and the company's response to electricity wiretapping from so-called squatters, as Chinese refugees were called in the 1950s and 1960s. So I'd just like to show you two clips from two CLP engineers.
illegal structure， 即係非法嘅建設嘅冇咧，就唔俾電嘅。我都見過咧，有啲唔識嘅有啲人偷電咧，喺我啲萬一伏特嗰啲高壓嗰度偷咧，電死好多人嘅。咁後期同呢個民政司署啊，佢哋商量啊咁樣，呢個保司署啊咁樣，都係決定咧，即係供電俾佢啦咁樣。
And here is the second excerpt.
Cables were laid by daily labour. They weren't China like power employees, they were cable gangs, and they were competing for work for their men. So you can imagine that it was quite easy to take, for our people, if they wanted to take money from the cable gang leaders by giving them work to do each day. We used to take on about 40,000 new consumers a year. Small factories, big factories. But it was very important if you put up a new factory building that you've got electricity. If you could pay the odd dollar to jump the queue, then you would. I remember when I was transmission and distribution engineer, we had two people, Colin Steele and somebody else, working for months and months and months, writing anti-corruption procedures to try to ensure that the process of applying for and obtaining electricity could be made free of corruption.
So other interviewees from CLP talk about instances of racial discrimination or tension between British, Chinese and Portuguese staff, something that was common in colonial era businesses. And I think in capturing and sharing these stories, CLP has been very candid and transparent about its history, but it's something that we're seeing more and more from corporations. More and more corporations around the world are tackling their history head on. For example, here in Britain, where I'm based, there was a BBC News article about Lloyd's Insurance Company, because they're hiring an archivist to dig into the history of its history of slave trade, with the slave trade. And similarly, the National Trust, which is an institution that looks after stately homes in the UK, is investigating the links of those stately homes and the people who own those homes with the slave trade, and it's attempting to decolonize its history. But of course, there will always be an inherent tension with regards to retaining the integrity of the historical endeavor in a for-profit environment. One of the criticisms of corporate-led oral history programs is a spectre of undue influence from that corporation or self-censorship by participants. From my experience, self-censorship was certainly an issue for people we interviewed who were still working for the company. But most of the people that we interviewed were retired, and they were very forthcoming with their memories of work, whether that was good or bad. And I think it should also be borne in mind that people who dislike their place of work will probably be much less likely to accept to be interviewed, and that will always skew the results of any oral history program. So we know that interviews are co-constructed by interviewer and the interviewee, and this is salient in a corporate heritage environment such as ours. As much as we try to remain neutral, our position as CLP archivists and corporate archivists will of course influence the trajectory of the interview in subtle ways. On the other hand, insider knowledge of a complex business like CLP, which is a really it does have a very complex history. There are local, regional, international operations, a separate holding company, a complex infrastructure network, multiple power stations that have come offline, online over the years, and a long history can only be beneficial to the interview process. And I think it's also really important to note that the project team were given the largest degree of freedom and independence to conduct interviews, and there was never any interference or influence from the business. So the last part of my talk today, I just want to talk quite briefly about using oral histories, and particularly in exhibition contexts. One of the core missions of the Heritage Project is to promote access to its collections. And one of the ways in which we do this is through exhibitions. Since 2010, we've organised 13 exhibitions which explore different facets of Hong Kong's history. Oral history has always been an integral and visible part of our exhibitions. They offer compelling narratives, foster audience engagement, and they can help engender a sense of empathy and understanding of history and of other people. It's a very powerful tool that can trigger strong emotions. So we sought to utilise and capitalise on the power of oral history by launching the Remembering Our Urban Legacies exhibition at the Hong Kong Cultural Centre. Oral histories were featured throughout this exhibition, and visitors to the exhibit were encouraged to send us their memories of specific Hong Kong landmarks on postcards which was designed by design students. Through this process, we try to invoke the audience's interpretation of place, as well as that of our oral history interviewees, rather than always impose our own. So the postcards became part of the exhibition, and so the exhibition narrative was very much driven in part by the audience. However, there are also challenges in using oral history as part of exhibition displays. Firstly, there are ethical considerations in using filmed interviews, which is why informed consent is really crucial, and we've always done that at the Heritage Project. However, many organisations prefer to interview people using audio as a kind of semi-anonymous medium. Secondly, some academics have criticised the decontextualisation of oral history in exhibitions more widely, primarily the use of sound bites, which divorces the interviewee from the whole story. However, I think it's always going to be necessary to edit oral histories and whatever context they are used in. alongside our exhibitions, we also have a YouTube channel where you can find many of our oral history films, and a website where you can find some of our oral history highlights and a list of our interviewees, although it's not an extensive list. We also have an oral history catalogue. Here is the one of the catalogues. This is the English catalogue. But ultimately, our aim as archivists is for researchers and scholars to use and interpret the collection themselves. That's our ultimate goal. So scholars are much more likely to make use of our paper records than our oral histories. And this reflects a general trend in academia, which privileges a written record over the spoken word. Having said that, there has definitely been scholars who have used our oral history collections. It's been used in doctoral dissertations, in journal articles, in books by people like Felicia Yap, who has studied Hong Kong and Singapore history, and she's now quite a well-established fictional writer. But I do hope that the collection and its hidden treasures will more fully be utilised in the future. Finally, in 2022, the Heritage Project Archive will be moving to a permanent home in CLP's former headquarters, which were based on Argyle Street in Mongkok, and it will be transformed into a museum facility. There will be a bigger office to receive researchers. You can see there the inside of the archive at the bottom right. There'll also be thematic exhibitions where we can more readily exhibit our oral histories and our other archival collections. Thank you very much. That is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Amelia. A round of applause for you. And especially since we did have some technical difficulties, but it seems like it all worked out at the end. So that's perfect. So now we can move on to the Q&A part of our presentation. And as always, feel free, audience members, to either write your comments or questions in the chat box, or message me or Dr. Shin, Michelle, for your questions. But I do have some questions to start us off, and I guess I will start off with one of the earlier questions that was asked. And I think you did mention it a little bit as well, but this audience member asked, do you think oral history methodology is applicable in studies of activism, or does the visibility of its participants limits its potentials in contemporary studies of politically sensitive issues?
So do you mean in, for example, interviewing young participants in movements that are ongoing?
I believe, at least from my interpretation of this question, I would say both, in the sense that, are these politically sensitive interviews not just, contemporary issues, but also past issues such as the 1967 riots, and whether, like you mentioned earlier, the possibility of seeing the person talk and having them give their experience in a record, with that, I guess, limit the potentials of oral history.
So do you mean in terms of if we wanted to interview activists about the activism today, or do you mean kind of specifically about the 1967 rioters?
I guess we can just stick with like the contemporary section. Yeah, perhaps just focus on like what are the implications for oral history in contemporary activism.
Okay, yeah, I think that probably wouldn't really be oral history because, well, I think it really depends. I mean, I think there's a kind of clear difference between kind of journalistic style of interview and oral history interview. I think, in oral history, you try not to be reductive. So I think if we were interviewing someone about the 1967 riots, if I came to
Ooh, I think, yeah, Amelia might be a little frozen right now. She is using, for our audience members, she is using her hotspot. So if it seems like she is frozen, it might be because she's experiencing internet issues. She did mention that she has an internet outage right now. So we can hope that she will log out and then log back in as last time. I'll quickly send her a message, letting her know that she's frozen right now. But yeah, once again, this is one of those small things that appear. Oh, and it seems like she did log out, so I think she may be logging back in. But I'll still send a message to her. Just give me a second.
In the meantime, I'll entertain the audience by saying that this is, I think the question is a very good one. It is because Hong Kong Studies Initiative has also done an oral history project about the umbrella movement. And certainly the issues that we need to be mindful of are very complex. If the purpose of an oral history archive is to present a variety of perspectives and a variety of angles, then I think the most challenging part is how does one identify and encourage interviewees from very different political persuasion to take part in the interview. I think something that Amelia mentioned earlier, that is in some way, it is really a factor of who is willing to be interviewed. Amelia, I think I bought you enough time. so the question.
I'm so sorry.
No worries. I was just talking about the challenges of doing oral history on activism, right? Because I was talking about the oral history that we do for the umbrella movement. We interview people who were in Canada and in Hong Kong who were part of that movement, or at least who were either an observer or a participant. And I think one point I wanted to raise was, even though we wanted to interview people from a wide spectrum of political persuasion, it's not often possible because it's sort of a self-selection. So what do you think about that sort of angle? So the challenges of recruiting interviewees.
I think that, I mean, it's always going to be a problem, because I think that, when we talk about oral history as being, a more democratic form of history or history from below, I mean, certainly you will always have the people who will be willing to participate are people who are more articulate, people who are better educated, people who are more self-confident. So I think that you will always have these kind of problems of inclusivity with oral history, no matter how much you try to kind of capture different voices. And I suppose with activism, I could see that also being an issue for that particular theme as well.
Thank you, Amelia. I'm just reading another question from the chat from Callie, and she's asking, I'll just read out the question or her comment, sorry. Thank you for the amazing presentation, Amelia. Could you talk a little bit more about the diversity of the project? I'm very curious about how the Oral History Project strikes a balance between presenting more diverse voices, especially in the rather controversial historical events. For instance, when some interviewees recalled the 1967 riots/protests in Hong Kong as, quote, ruddy rioters, did the project also attempt to include interviewees from the other side, i.e. the left?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think, we have to be quite careful when we approach these interviews, not to judge the interviewees, because they have shared their stories with us. And I think, certainly I've heard much more controversial than that. And that is, something that is controversial as well. But I mean, I've heard all types of comments said in oral histories, unfortunately. But I think that's just the nature of the genre. But I think, your question about diversity is really important. I think one aspect of where the project is really not diverse, unfortunately, is in its inclusion of female voices. I think that's something that needs to be addressed. There's actually really kind of maybe 20% of the interviewees are female. I think in terms of the 1967 writers, the leftists, I think it would be it's really imperative to include their voices. I know that Ray Yap and Professor Robert Bickers in 2009, they've done quite a lot more work on the riots, the 67 riots, and that's becoming much more as part of kind of Hong Kong historiography more recently. I think that, that would be my Chinese colleagues who would do those interviews. I don't speak Chinese, unfortunately, so I couldn't do those interviews. And I will have to check and see if we do actually have some interviews with leftists. I will ask my colleagues, but I think it would be absolutely, as you say, really imperative in terms of inclusivity to actually include those voices too.
Thank you. Just like, I guess, like a small follow-up then. Are there, I guess, other, does the oral history project also include, I guess, voices or interviews from Hong Kong's other minority groups, such as, like I said, Sikh or Indian other voices?
Yeah, so I interviewed a couple of Parsis. I interviewed a couple of Indians, Sikhs, one Pakistani interviewee, quite a number of Nepalese, but unfortunately there was some communities that I just couldn't gain access to. So I had to abandon quite a few of those projects, unfortunately. So yeah, but it does definitely contain those interviews, yes.
Mm-hmm. Oh, perfect. I do have I do see like some other questions in the chat, but I do have like one, like a slightly personal question in a way, or just personal curiosity in a way. Since you've mentioned that you yourself do conduct part of these interviews or lead these interview sessions, I was just wondering if you, a little bit back, you mentioned how some of the oral history interviews that you do, there are concerns about who are the interests involved, if there's self-censorship. So I'm just wondering if you've noticed any of these attempts at self-censoring your own questions that you give, the questions that you ask. Yeah, just out of curiosity, just how do you yourself do these interviews, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think no matter how much you try, you will always kind of bring to the table your own value judgments, your own biases, really. And I think it's really, really important to try and kind of deconstruct that for yourself. I think, one example that I was going to talk about for the Marine police officers is that, going into the interview, you have to kind of try and question, what are my attitudes towards this group, towards the police? What comes to mind when I think of the police, and trying to kind of, I suppose it's about unconscious bias, really, and trying to kind of deconstruct that. But I mean, in terms of my own interviews, self-censorship, I think not so much self-censorship, but I think, there have been times when, I haven't wanted to probe more deeply because I haven't wanted to offend that person, the sensibilities of that person. There's some instances of interviews specifically with particular groups who, know the history of that group. I'm thinking, for example, with the Jewish refugees in Shanghai. A lot of people who went to Shanghai and who came back, they've read books, they've seen films, So some aspects of their interviews are influenced by what they've read about their history, and it's not necessarily their own story. And I think that in those contexts, I wouldn't want to kind of pick apart those interviews. So I think that is kind of, maybe that is self-censorship, or I don't know. Yeah, because I think in oral histories, you know, there's a kind of human connection aspect to it. There's an aspect where you have to be emotive and empathetic. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like a, you know, like a delicate balance between, you know, being respectful of their time, but also trying to maintain some of that
yes,
meaningfulness from the discussion.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Thank you. Okay, I do have two other comments from the audience, and I guess one commonality between the two is given the current events in Hong Kong and the current political atmosphere in Hong Kong, what are, I guess, have there been any effects? Has this had any effect in the workings of the Hong Kong Heritage Project, or has it not? Has it just been, you know, something that just happened and has not affected the HKHP?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. Unfortunately, I can't speak to that because I'm not based in Hong Kong. I'm based in London, so I'm working remotely. But I mean, I don't think it has. But of course, I think what is happening in Hong Kong at the moment, you know, it must have some kind of impact on history and the way that history is written and on scholarship. But I don't think it has had an influence on the way that the archive is run or the way that the Heritage Project has been operating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I do have one shorter question, but and I guess this is more like a curiosity question from the audience member, but how far back does the Hong Kong Heritage Project go to in terms of their oral history archives, but also just the physical documents themselves? What are the oldest documents that you have?
The oldest document that we have is from the 1880s, and it's from the Hong Kong and Shanghai hotels collection. So it's one of the old ledger books, the minute books. So that collection, the hotel collection, is the oldest one, and it has quite you know, quite intrinsic historical value because of its date range. The rest of the collection from the Kaduri family dates from the early 1930s. So the rest of the collection is very much kind of 1930s. The CLP collection goes back to 1901 as well, but that's more minute books and memorandum and articles of association and things like that. So it's very much a 20th century archive.
Thank you. Yeah, I do remember using some of the sources there, and I do remember going to the physical place as well. And I do agree when I saw the plan for the new archive, and one of the things that you mentioned was space. I can very much agree with that, because the current building is very cozy. I would say where the archive is located, it's very cozy. Which isn't anything bad. It's very cozy.
It is very cozy.
I do have one question from another sent to me. They wanted to know whether I guess this question is more like how accessible are the documents themselves, and I guess this goes into a little bit about the preservation of these documents. Could you speak a little bit about how the HKHP preserves and safeguards these documents physically, and how accessible are they to the public?
Well, I think they're really very accessible. Just to give you a little bit of background about the corporate archive scene in Hong Kong today, I think there's only 3 corporate archives that are open to the public. That's Swires, HSBC, and ourselves. There's a couple of others, but I think they're not open to the public as yet. So we operate on a kind of date range of access. So records that are over a certain period of time, they are open to the public. And I think that because Ryan, I mean, you will have seen, you've used the archive as well. I think it is kind of quite accessible in terms of what we offer to the public. In terms of how we preserve those materials, just standard archival procedure. They are kept in a humidity and temperature controlled repository, kept in acid-free paper and acid-free boxes. They are catalogued, so they are readily accessible by everyone in the team. So I think it's quite an accessible and well-preserved collection. But I think that when the collection moves in 2022 to the new museum facility, it will be in an even better repository, and that will really be a state-of-the-art repository. So that'll be fantastic.
And just a quick follow-up then. How are these documents, or how are these documents and the archive themselves, how are they, I guess, future-proofed? Have there been attempts by the HKHB to, I guess, use preserve them in a digital archive in a way?
Yeah, we have digitized some of the collection. I think, digitization is kind of a contentious issue in the archive world because, the technology is just changing all the time. So I think if you, digitize on TIFF format, which I think is the archival format, in 10 years' time, it'll change again. It's like microform and microfilm. It's kind of obsolete now, really, in quite a lot of with digitization. Is that if you want to do it properly, it's really, really resource intensive. It's a very, very expensive process. But having said that, we have digitized portions of the collection, especially for them to be in use in exhibition context.
Right, especially like one of the, I guess, debates over this is just, if you digitize them, you lose some of that physicalness to it, and it's that physicalness that really gives it a sense of it being a document, it being an archival material. Just having it in front of you, holding it, kind of is an experience that you won't have if you just solely use the digital archive.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and yeah, that's spot on. And it's a context that you lose. And I have used some digital archives, and they're actually very difficult to use because you're kind of divorcing that paper record from the rest of the file. And actually, that is what makes you understand that letter, is by reading, all the letters preceding it, and by understanding why that record, why that file was created. So exactly, I think that's absolutely spot on.
Thank you. I do have one quick question from Graham Hutchins, who asks, are most of the interviews you and your colleagues have conducted with people in Hong Kong? If not, where else in the world have you interviewed people?
Yes, thank you. Well, I went to the United States in 2010 to interview some Jewish refugees who had fled Europe for Shanghai. And then after the war, they'd subsequently emigrated to America, San Francisco. I interviewed some people in Britain. So one of the engineers that you saw for CLP, he was interviewed in Britain because quite a number of them had retired there. One of my colleagues went to Australia, and I think in Australia, she interviewed retirees, and she also interviewed some Shanghai Jewish refugees who had settled in Australia as well.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely just sounds like it's a lot of different places is what you're getting at. Yeah, and also I guess one of the perks of working in the archive is
absolutely
in the oral archive is the travel, I guess. Let me just check. It seems again, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to post it in the chat box, and we'll try to answer them or raise it up as soon as possible. Okay. There is one from FL FAMO. Wondering about the archival standards, if you know them, such as the rules for archival description fonts and file level. How searchable are they in English, and is the catalog also searchable in Chinese?
No, we didn't create a bilingual catalogue, and that's just because there was only 5 of us in the archive, and it was only at that time me and the archivist who was Chinese who were working on the archive side. And, you know, it was just a huge amount of work really in terms of the acquisitions, in terms of the preservation, in terms of devising all the policy, the cataloguing. So, you know, it wasn't translated into Chinese. And I think also that, you know, if you translate a file that is in English into Chinese, then it's a little bit pointless anyway, because when you get to the file, you know, it is in English anyway. But I think it's really important, you know, if we could in some ways, you know, try to make the oral history more accessible by, you know, maybe in the future kind of translating the oral histories of Chinese into English into Chinese. I think that would be really beneficial. But yes, we do we do you know, standardize all of the titles, the fonts levels, the series level, and that's all searchable on our website as well. There is an archives tab on our website. If you saw the address before, it's www.hongkongheritage.org, and you'll be able to search at the fonts, series and record level, and you'll be able to search for secondary sources as well, such as books and films that we have.
Thank you. I guess I'll ask 2 more questions because I am mindful of time. One question is from Michelle, and she's wondering, has the revitalization of the CLP clock tower impacted the archival work of the Hong Kong Heritage Project?
I don't think it has, just simply because I think that we have not received any new collections for quite a number of years. So, you know, we've already kind of received all of the collections a couple of years ago. Most of the cataloguing work has been done. I think that in moving to the clock tower, it will just mean that, you know, as Ryan, as you were saying, it's quite cozy, as is at the moment. And, you know, I think it will just make it a much nicer environment for researchers to go to, you know, and hopefully it will kind of be more like the Public Records Office in Kwun Tong, where, you know, you have this kind of big reading room where researchers can get together there, and where, you know, hopefully it'll be a kind of focal point as a kind of business archive in Hong Kong, much more accessible for researchers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I guess Graham will have the last question. And his question is, are there any equivalent projects preserving the history of Macau that you know of?
Oh, I'm sorry, I really don't know. I mean, I'm sure that, you know, there probably are quite a few Macanese histories, but I can't answer that question. Ryan, do you have any idea?
Somewhat. I do know that there's like a Twitter page for old Macanese, like old Macau photos. If you're interested in photo archives, Graham, that's one. But again, yeah, I would I'm on the same page as Amelia. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm certain that there should be an archive or 2 about Macau and its history. But yeah, no, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Amelia, for persevering with all the technical issues. I'll give it to Dr. Shin to end us off.
Well, thank you, Ryan, for moderating, and thank you very much, Amelia. This is wonderful, and that really fulfills what we want to do with this City Archive series. That is to learn more about the different attempts or efforts to preserve materials related to Hong Kong history, and of course challenges and opportunities. Right. So those are all of those. You have done wonderfully to share with us. So thank you very much. particularly, I was very interested to learn that the clock tower, the old CLP headquarters, will become the museum, because I used to live not far from there, and I remember passing by it all the time. So now, so that picture is very familiar to me. So that image is very familiar to me. So it's interesting to know. And also, I want to thank.
Well, Dr. Shin, maybe...
Yeah. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I just wanted to say, oh, maybe we should interview you, because we're trying to capture all these memories, but I will email you later. Sorry to interrupt.
I guess I've reached a certain age. Anyway.
No, not.
That's perfectly fine. I just want to, I want to say thank you to the student helpers today. Ryan, you and Justin and Michelle, and they're always, as usual, been very helpful working behind the scene to make it happen. So, and I want to thank the audience again. I think Ryan at the beginning was a bit more optimistic than we usually are in the turnaround of the recording. It'll take us more than a few days. It'll take us a few weeks perhaps. But in any case, check back our website or subscribe to our YouTube channel. As soon as it is ready, we'll put it up. Our goal really is also to make things as accessible as possible, especially with speakers' approval. We like to have our events recorded and be made available, because I think this is, that's what historians care about. We like to preserve things and make things available. And so thank you for the audience, and thank you for everyone for taking part. And once again, thank you, Amelia. Okay, so.